On a late spring afternoon in 2022, I had left work and headed for one of the county parks. I had been metal detecting for nearly a year at that point when I had walked through a part of the West Park filled with loads of iron trash signals, canning jar lids, horse tack, rings and buckles, parts of an old wood-fired stove and car parts, and countless bits of aluminum. Enough had come out of the ground early on that I'd decided to research who might have owned it all. Eventually, I found a county map from 1880, which fortunately had township and range printed over it. And so I found Thomas Chandler. But this isn't his story alone, because that early June afternoon, I dug up a very high signal, a 94 on my apex. What came out of the hole was a small rectangle of brass, very corroded, except for where I had grazed it with my shovel. I could not imagine what it was, so into the trash pouch it went, and onward I went. Now, this is a piece that I dug out of the ground, and when I dug it out, it was absolutely caked with dirt and grime, and I didn't think anything of it, didn't even realize that it might be something interesting. But once I put it into the apple cider vinegar, I think you can see there, I noticed there is this etching. And so, as I'm looking at this right now, as I'm trying to show you, this is the etching that is on a business card sized printer's plate. And I had no clue that that was what I dug out of the ground, and that's why I didn't film it. Turns out, this plate has some really cool local connection. Now, mind you, this is backwards. And what I did initially was to try to actually use ink. And I don't have a rubber roller. But eventually what I did is just scratch with a graphite pencil. And so I'm going to stop this and show you a photograph of it reversed. And the reason I'm going to do this is, first, that the family in question that this is connected to lived in the area in the earliest part of the 1900s and the 1800s. And in fact, this person's grandfather homesteaded in Kansas at about the time that we were a state. He shows up in an 1865 census. But I'll show you more here in a second about that. Let me show you what this says as reflected in a mirror. So it's hard to see. I thought this was an H at the beginning, in the beginning of looking at it. But in actuality, this says Miss Elva Chandler. I immediately recognized the Chandler name and recalled Thomas owning the property in 1880, where I recovered the plate. So I felt I had to understand the connection. In the inevitable scattergun style of fact-finding, I found Elva, Thomas, Susie, and William, Vernon, and Ruby, and others, with absolutely no understanding of their chronology. Never mind how common the name Chandler is in the U.S. Slowly, however, I have pieced together a short story of Miss Elva and some of her family history. Thomas Prather Chandler first enters Kansas territorial records in the 1860 census. The Kansas Territory had only been opened for settlement 6 years prior, and this time period saw much violence between slavery supporters and abolitionists. Mr. Chandler had chosen to live somewhat north of the focal points that were Lawrence, Franklin, Lecompton, and Topeka. Thomas was listed as a farmer in Jefferson County. In the month of November of that same year, he married Addie Stagg, and by 1865, they had 2 daughters, and a son would arrive before year's end. As a historical framework, 2 years later, Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer, serving under General W.S. Hancock, entered western Kansas and eastern Colorado to engage the southern Cheyennes and Kiowas, while in the eastern parts of Kansas a cholera outbreak was spreading from the south and east, primarily along the Missouri River and military roads following troop movements. I could not find any reason recorded for Addie's death, but I am immediately drawn to these events that killed tens of thousands across the interior states. The 1870 census then records the fact that Thomas's son William and his sisters were being cared for by Lewis Finch and Finch's mother, who lived next door to the children's cousins on their mother's side. I could not find Thomas listed anywhere. However, Mr. Chandler shows up in an 1875 agricultural census, farming 40 acres of crops in Delaware Township of Wyandotte County, the location I unearthed the plate. The 1880 census showed Thomas and son William, just 14, living then at the 60-acre farm. Almost 1 year after, though, finding the printer's plate, I recovered a seated dime dated 1876, our centennial year, and I can't help but wonder what transpired after it went missing. Was its loss sorely felt? 2 decades later, William had grown, married Susie, had children, and taken over as head of household at the farm. The family seemed to be active and thriving. By 1915, their home had grown to include Elva and Ruby, along with hosting still the now elderly Thomas. The horse tack and buckles shown were all dug from around the area of their barn. And it's here now that I'll take us back to the printer's plate. I assume Elva's sister Myrtle had one, and that her younger sister may also have received one, but the tradition was falling out of favor. Calling cards or visiting cards originally became popular in France and spread to the British Empire and across Europe back in the 1700s. Miss Elva caught the end of a 2-century-long fad. When one called on a friend or acquaintance, the card would serve as a part of the announcement of one's arrival, or serve to mark one's thanks for inclusion, say at a dinner party. Oscar Wilde employed the device to hide his identity after his release from prison. Isn't that so, Mr. Sebastian? What use was made of Elva's calling cards, I cannot say, though. I assume that after her mother died in 1918, soldiers returning from abroad and their families might not have been called upon by Elva. In 1930, we find her and her sister Ruby boarding in the house of a local banker, both of them teachers at an elementary school nearby. And in 1940, at 37, Elva is back at the farm, but still teaching. This was actually one of the first facts I'd discovered about Miss Elva, but it only led me backward in time. It was only after finding the listings for Thomas and William in the Bonner Springs Cemetery on the Find a Grave website that I ran across notes by a Miss Dolores Owen, their memorial manager. Her diligence and thorough notes led me finally, nearly 1 year after finding Miss Elva's calling card plate, to her married name. I loaded into my truck on the first free afternoon I had and headed for the cemetery. Locating Thomas did not take long, nor did finding William and Susie. So this is Elva's grandfather, 1833 to 1917, Thomas P. Chandler. So as you can see, Elva's mom died a few years after she was born, and her dad survived a few years after she married Howard. So this is Elva Mead. For the longest time, I hadn't been able to find her because all I knew her as was Elva Chandler. And when I'd found her and her father listed in the 1940 census, I was pretty excited. But that still didn't get me the answer. It's nice to meet you, Elva. After marrying Harold, they moved into his house with his mom, and they had one daughter, and that house was only 1 mile east of where Elva had grown up. So just there in the trees is the house site, and there are 76, I think it was, acres here that Elva married to her husband, raising a daughter, had farmed. And this is, sorry about the road noise, but this is on the corner near the highway and the main road that goes down toward Edwardsville from up here at the hilltop. So if you're still with me, I want you to know I appreciate you staying till the end. And I hope you enjoyed a little story about Miss Elva.